Hello, I am focusing on responding to ELL Writing, and I am mostly focusing on written commentary and conferencing. I will address some of the issues surrounding error correction, but I am not necessarily going in depth I'm not going in depth to discuss the debate around error correction just because I feel that that would take the conversation in a different direction. I'm also not going to focus on peer response because I feel that that is a completely different topic from teacher response. So the reason why I decided to focus on teacher response and feedback is because I find this topic completely incredibly fascinating, and the reason for that is because ever since I was a tutor, I believe that feedback is crucial to a student's development as a writer. However, I do acknowledge that it is extremely complicated because it involves so many variables. We always have to consider the type of assignment, the type of student, the time of the semester, how we're going to deliver the feedback. So it just involves so many things that we as teachers really have to think about, and we really have to be aware of our delivery. And we also have to be honest, but we have to be careful to not discourage our students. And that's another reason why I chose this topic, because I feel that it is very powerful, and oftentimes it is what students remember the most. I always encounter students who tell me that they do not like writing or they do not like reading because of particular feedback that they received when they were younger. So it's interesting to me how feedback stays with us. I remember being in college and receiving feedback from my professors, and that feedback has stayed with me. So unfortunately, like with so many other things, we tend to remember the negative feedback the most. So like I said, it's very powerful. It can encourage students or it could discourage them as well. And the final reason why I chose this topic is because I actually enjoy providing feedback. I like getting to know students, and I like communicating with them. I particularly enjoy conferences because I get to talk to the student and interact with the student. I basically get to know the student behind the writer. And I feel that this is very important. I like to ask my students questions. I like to ask them why they made particular writing choices, because that lets me know if I need to teach the skill or if I need to clarify some concepts. So that's probably the part of providing feedback that I enjoy the most, is interacting with students. A little bit of overview regarding feedback. In my research, I found that research on feedback was not really done until the 1970s, and this is also when the writing as a process approach became popular. So I figure since writing was seen as a process, teachers decided that feedback would help students during the different stages of the process. However, in the 1980s, there was a negative perception of feedback. Basically, the research studies concluded that students did not like feedback, they did not find it useful, and basically, it was a waste of time for teachers to provide feedback, which I found very surprising. However, in the 1990s, this perception shifted, and there was a more balanced view of teacher response. Basically, studies found that students do not mind feedback if it is clear and provides a solution. And I think it's very interesting that the 90s changed the perception of feedback, because as somebody who grew up in the 90s, I was in elementary school during the 90s, and I've always had a very positive perception of feedback, and I think that this is probably because I was a product of the 90s. So it was instilled in me that feedback is positive and it is helpful. Another thing I found interesting is that L2 writing research is heavily influenced by L1 teacher response theory, and the reason I found this interesting and a bit surprising is because I feel that the two populations are different, so I do feel that there are certain issues in L2 writing that warrant their own research. L2 writing does have substantial research on error correction, but other than that, there are a lot of other areas where they overlap. This table by Dana R. Ferris that I found in the text Response to Student Writing, she illustrates the similarities between the L1 and L2 analysis model for teacher commentary, and the table really does show that there's a striking resemblance between both models, and basically the concepts are the same. The only difference really has to do a lot with the wording and the terminology. So, like I said, I was very surprised to find that L2 and L1 research regarding teacher response theory really do overlap in many areas. Some of the issues that Dana R. Ferris mentions in her text regarding feedback mostly have to do with the specifics of feedback. The first issue is what to focus on. I feel that this is an issue that has been ongoing for a long time, and it's also an issue that there are no easy answers to. A lot of teachers believe that we should focus on fluency, while others believe that we should focus on accuracy. There are a lot who think we should focus on error. However, the current trend says that we should focus on content. And like I said, this is the current trend. I know that before, the trend was to focus on error. I personally focus on content and then I address error. However, if error interferes with meaning, then I focus on error before. Another issue is, how does teacher feedback affect revision and improvement in student writing? I feel that this is a question that most instructors ask themselves, because we do want to know how our feedback is affecting revision and if it's being utilized by the student. I do not know if there's an answer for this. I think that it depends on the student, and also it depends on how we measure improvement. The other issue is, what forms does teacher feedback take? And I think that teacher feedback can take a lot of forms. The most common ones are written commentary and conferences. Research does show that L2 populations respond better to conferences. So I would tend to agree with that, because I utilize a lot of conferences with my L2 students and they have worked out very, very well. Dana R. Ferris also mentioned some other issues that warrant more research, and the first issue I feel is extremely important. We have discussed this in our class in previous readings, and this mostly has to do with who are the subjects, what is their motivation for writing, and what is their background in composition. As teachers, we always tell our students to know their audience, and I feel that this also applies to us. When we are providing feedback, we have to know our audience. We have to know what their motivations are. We have to know what their background is. And the reason for that is because knowing this information helps us determine what type of feedback to provide and how to deliver it. Whenever I have conferences with my students, I like to ask them why they made a particular writing choice, because this lets me know if I need to teach a skill or if I just need to clarify certain concepts. So knowing our audience and their needs is extremely, extremely important. Another issue is, what is the institutional context or type of class? This is important because we do need to determine how the class affects the type of feedback that we convey. For example, in an L1 class like English 111, the type of feedback is different. I do less conferencing just because those students are a little bit more independent and they tend to want to work on things on their own, whereas with my developmental class, they do need that extra interaction to define certain terms and discuss their writing, because a lot of them are not very familiar with the writing process. So that's where the conferences really do help. Another issue that I find very important is, what techniques, mechanisms, and so on does the teacher use to give feedback? I think that this is definitely something that warrants more research, particularly because there are so many advances in technology that now we can provide feedback in so many different ways. So I think it'd be interesting to research if students prefer those advanced technological advances, or if they just prefer basic old-fashioned feedback on paper and in person. From what I've found with my students, they prefer the old-fashioned feedback where we sit and talk, or I write comments on their paper. The last one is also very important. How is improvement measured? I believe that we can measure improvement in our courses throughout the semester, but I do not know if we can measure long-term improvement of our students as writers. Since they leave our classes, they get other types of feedback from other teachers, so I feel that this is difficult to measure. I do feel that a lot of students keep a lot of that feedback with them, like I mentioned earlier, but I do not know how we necessarily measure this. Some of the challenges that I think we face as instructors when providing feedback, the first one obviously has to do with time. It is very time consuming, yet it is also what we spend the most time doing. Another issue involves our students. Some students do not take the feedback into consideration. Others do not really participate in conferences or show up not prepared. So these are challenges that we face as well. Another challenge is determining the proper stage to provide feedback. Studies do show that it is better to provide feedback during the earlier stages of writing. Students are less likely to incorporate feedback into revision if it's the final draft, if it's provided during the final draft, because they consider that to be a dead draft. So again, it's interesting because I think it really does depend on the students. Some students really do benefit from providing feedback on their final draft because they can apply it to their next essay, while others would benefit more from having feedback during the earlier stages. I really do think that it depends on the student. And perhaps the biggest challenge is providing valuable, specific, and meaningful feedback that meets the student's needs. I believe that if the feedback is not going to be useful, and if it does not address the student's needs, then there is no reason to provide it, because then it won't fulfill its purpose. And of course, another challenge is ensuring that feedback does not fail. And feedback really fails when students do not understand it, and this could be that they don't understand the writing, or they don't understand the comment that this teacher is addressing. It could be so many things that they don't understand, so providing feedback that they understand is a big challenge. Also, sometimes students try to incorporate feedback to please teachers, and they lose complete ownership of their text, so this could also be a problem as well. And yet another challenge is that some students might actually see the need for feedback, but they might not be able to actually, they might not know how to go about that. So that is another challenge that we face as teachers, which is we need to make sure that we provide a direction and sort of like a guide for students to be able to incorporate this feedback into their revisions or future essays. So despite the challenges that we face, I do believe that most teachers appreciate and value feedback, and I think that the reason for this is because we do see that our students improve whenever they incorporate feedback into their essays, and we also see that we learn a lot from our students when we provide feedback and when we interact with them. So because of that reason, I feel that teachers will continue to find ways to provide feedback and will continue to research ways to make it more effective. And I feel that feedback is an area that will continue to develop and evolve as the years go by. So how does this apply to my situation? Well, it applies to me because most of my classes consist of ELL students. I also teach developmental writing, so for ELL students and developmental writing students, feedback is extremely important because many of them are not familiar with the writing process, so they really do rely on feedback to improve. And also it applies to my situation because our current department is providing more ELL professional development, so this topic really ties in with what we are trying to do as a department. Thank you.